and come along and be with us as we review the week. You know, this week we were once again all back in school shooting hell. There were the usual calls for gun control that are not going to happen. I want to give listeners some idea how gun control stands in Washington compared to Texas, compared to more restrictive gun control states, and whether anything's likely to change here. Isabella, can you start us off with some information about how we do things in Washington State here?
Sure, yeah. And I'm not an expert in this subject, but just, there were a few bills signed into law earlier this year that are going to kind of change how Washington handles gun measures and how schools respond to school shootings. But, we know in Texas, the shooter bought 375 rounds of ammo just days after turning 18. And in Washington State, no one under the age of 21 would be allowed to even purchase a semi-automatic assault rifle, but there aren't limits on ammunition purchases currently. And that's true for the next couple of months until there's a law that's going to go into effect banning the sale of magazines that carry more than 10 rounds of ammo. So in Washington State, legally a shooter wouldn't be able to have or purchase that much ammo in the first place.
And Katherine, you were telling me that Washington State has a relatively low mass shooting rate?
Yeah, that's right. I pulled some data from the Gun Violence Archive and I cross-referenced that with census population figures. Washington's per capita rate of mass shootings is slightly lower than California and New York, but I want to inject a huge, helping of salt into that analysis because there just aren't that many mass shootings that happen every year. I think it's more interesting to note that the per capita mass shooting rate in California, Texas, and New York, which have very different gun control regimes. California and New York's laws are significantly beefier than Texas's. The per capita rates of mass shootings in those three states are similar, which to me suggests maybe that action is needed federally rather than on the state level.
Mm-hmm. Jonathan, background checks, concealed carry. What else should we know about where Washington stands relative to other states, relative to Texas, and what might change?
It has been interesting that gun control out of the legislature had been, until recently, they'd relatively left it to the initiative process. We've passed a series of initiatives on storage and on the red flag laws that were pretty robust changes in the law.
I want to explain a red flag law as a way to take away a gun from someone or keep a gun from someone. But this last session, the legislature has gone. I think the reason why the legislature has been less robust on the gun control is that it had been more of a little more of a centrist caucus. It was trying to keep a lot of legislators from in swing districts, electing them as Democrats. The caucus has gone. The Democrats, which run on the House and Senate, have gone a little bit more progressive in the last several cycles. So this last session was as Isabella said, was was an aggressive set of legislation that passed. I was mentioning too that we're talking about mass shootings, and I think that addressing mass shootings in a way is it's obviously something that we should be continuing to talk about. But I kind of wanted to focus the conversation on mass shootings in schools. I think this is the thing that just punches society in the gut, that a kid can, or a young man can walk into a school and shoot. And we've seen this again and again and again. And in Texas, Texas had put money into securing schools after that. There's a San Antonio high school shooting. And they had done a lot of the prevention measures that were advocated by the Second Amendment crowd, including having armed security there, having fencing around the building, having locks on classroom doors, having active shooter drills, and it didn't prevent. All of those had been active at this school in Texas, and none of those worked. And I just wonder if we should really be talking about guns, or if we're talking about the prevention measures that would stop the shooters. Yeah, there's been a lot of attention to the police and why did it take so long for them to go inside, and where was the
the armed security guard at the entrance. I just can't tell where that discussion is going, especially in rural Texas. Is the conclusion going to be, look, we have all these preventions in place, and I guess a good guy with a gun system doesn't stop a bad guy with a gun? Or is the conclusion going to be, wow, it's not enough. We really gotta arm up. We need twice as many. We need 3 times as many machine guns at the entrance. I don't know. Does any thoughts on what the point is? What might change out of this discussion?
Even in this moment where we have very, very divided politics, I think one thing that can unite political differences is an attention on mental health. We know now that people under the age of 19, gun deaths are now the most common cause of death. It surpassed car crashes. And the pandemic, I think, had something to do with that. And I think, unfortunately, a rise in teen suicide rates also played into that. But if Congress can come around anything, it would hope to be having a better mental health system for kids in schools. I have 2 kids in Seattle schools, and the voters wisely, in my mind, have supported the Families and Ed levies, which put mental health, they put clinics in every high school in Seattle. I know my kids have benefited from having a therapist at the school that can really talk out the stresses that come with a teenage life. What about shifting this conversation away from the guns, which we've been high centered on now for a generation, basically, and putting more of the focus on a better mental health system?
Yeah, Jonathan, I think there's definitely something to be said for that. One thing that makes me think it's regrettably likely that the conversation will turn towards increasing security around schools instead of focusing on mental health is we know that I think just last month, Texas's governor cut hundreds of millions of dollars for mental health spending in Texas. The state is delinquent when it comes to mental health services for its residents, according to nonprofits and experts that track these sort of things. I don't see that that's something that we're going to rally around anytime soon. Although I think your point is well taken that it could be a very potent solution. It's one that's overwhelmingly popular. I think I was looking at some Gallup polling showing that 83% of Americans support increased mental health services as a way to try to prevent school shootings.
I want to expand on that just a little bit too, because I was recently at Lake Stevens High School with Representative Susan Del Bene, who was sitting and listening to educators talk about just pandemic-related struggles. And one was that there's a lot of students that rely on the schools for mental health services and programs and counseling, and why they're in school or after school programs. And I think that's something that's also not taken into account is how much students do rely on schools to provide those necessary services, especially when they're not embedded in the community. And then there's school districts like Marysville School District, who just had a double levy failure, and they're looking at cutting programs like that at a critical time to have access to those.
Yeah, you reminded me that I want to send a similar shout out to, I'm on Mercer Island, where Youth and Family Services there has counselors in every school, and my kids have availed themselves, and it's fantastic. And I it seems like, is this Republican and these Republican initiatives they're talking about going back to basics, sticking with academics, reading, writing, arithmetic. Don't talk to kids about lifestyles and values. And is that extending to counseling in effect?
Well, at least I could speak to some of the rural school districts up here, or just Marysville School District again. The newer school board members were looking at, those cuts valuing just the essentials and not social emotional learning, which I think a lot of educators have argued became far more important just during the pandemic, when students are unable to focus on their learning because they're just simply not okay. They just need to be brought to a baseline of stability before they can get any work done. But these school board members, may not be looking at the big picture.
Well, I could certainly see your point taken. I think you could certainly see more mental health counselors in the school could become politicized, but anything in society can be politicized in this moment. What we did see is Congress stopped basically a Great Depression from happening in April 2020. If Congress wants to put the money into something, there is the money to do it. It was really revelatory to me to watching the federal government spring into action to solve a problem, and it saved millions, tens of millions of jobs. And if there is enough will, and I hope that school shootings can be one thing that we can agree is a true evil in society. I don't see it's just a matter of the will and not the resources to me.
Before we leave this topic, which will be a pleasure, was it Isabella? Were you telling me that there's a law in Washington banning some kinds of active shooter drills because of a traumatic effect, because of a negative effect on kids' mental health?
Yeah, there was a study that came out, I believe, earlier this year that basically said that active shooter drills that include, simulations, whether that's like popping or flashing or something that could make students think there's an active threat, that can be incredibly traumatizing and triggering for students who may have had an active shooter on campus. So the law is only going to ban those drills that could potentially be traumatizing, that include those dramatic effects. There will still be active shooter drills.
Okay. All right. Then finally, I guess a program note. And if you're listening to this program, if you're interested in this conversation, then you might want to know I'm doing this podcast series called Subtext: What Goes Unsaid. And I would like to discuss the fears that we had or have, if you're a student right now. We're going to be talking about unsaid fears, an unspoken fear you never talked about. This came out of a quick conversation I had with my daughter, where she was reassuring me that she felt safe going to school, and which I hope is true. We talked it through, but I remembered back to things that I was afraid of that I didn't talk about. And so I thought there might in this podcast series about what goes unsaid, that maybe it would be good to surface some of that conversation, talking about the things we don't talk about. So if you have a contribution to make, if you have a story you want to tell, my email address is yours. It's bradke@kuow.org. So use it. Email me at bradke@kuow.org. Again, it's part of a new KUOW podcast feed called KUOW Shorts. It's a bunch of short series. The first episode dropped this week, so it's there. You can hear it by searching KUOW Shorts wherever you get your podcasts. Okay, let's take a short break, and we're going to come back with more news of the week with my journalist colleagues. Don't go away. Week in Review coming right back, and we are live streaming on YouTube and Facebook as well.
.949 KUOW, Seattle's NPR news station. It's 12:21. We're at 59 degrees in Seattle. Chance of showers is our forecast for today. We expect to reach a high of about 64.
I'm Julian Marshall, host of BBC News Hour. On today's program, America's powerful gun lobby group, the NRA, meets just days after a teenage gunman killed 19 children and 2 teachers at a school in Texas. And Russian forces make further gains in Ukraine's Donbas region.
You'll hear those stories and more today on BBC NewsHour. It begins at 1 p.m. right after Week in Review.
Support for KUOW comes from Bill and Paula Clapp in partnership with Seattle Foundation, saluting the Seattle YMCA for providing summer camps to over 3,000 young people last year. The Y is now expanding these camps to reach even more youth. Learn more about how to help at seattleymca.org/camp.
It's KUOW's Week in Review. I'm Bill Radke here along with the Everett Herald's Isabella Breda, Seattle Times' Jonathan Martin, and Insider's Katherine Long. This week, Seattle Pacific University said it will continue to prohibit staff from participating in, quote, sexual behavior that is inconsistent with the university's understanding of biblical standards. That means SPU employees are forbidden from extramarital sex, no cohabitating before marriage, no sexual activity between same-sex couples, and SPU will not hire employees who are gay, lesbian, or transgender. About 200 students and staff walked out of class on Tuesday to rally outside the campus administration building.
We want gay faculty! We want gay faculty! 2, 4, 6, 8! Christian hate won't make me straight!
That rally turned into an overnight sit-in that's expected to continue through the weekend. This is SPU's interim president, Pete Menharis, trying to address the crowd.
I also know that you're disappointed with the recent announcement from the Board of Trustees, and I can't speak for them. And I also know that you want change, and change isn't happening fast enough for you. And I recognize that.
Both of those audio clips there from King 5 in Seattle. Jonathan Martin, I know that SPU is a private Christian school, but I actually didn't know that that kind of hiring discrimination was legal. Is there no question about that?
It is. There is a religious exemption to anti-discrimination laws in Washington. I should say too on SPU. I attended SPU for a year, and my uncle was a president there, so I have some familiarity with how the school polices student conduct. I was going to say on the anti-discrimination exemption, there was tested this year by a gay lawyer at a Union Gospel Mission who the case went to the state Supreme Court, and he won, although it didn't win in a way that eliminated the exemption. And the U.S. Supreme Court just decided that they were not going to hear the case, which was interesting given the composition of the court. For me, so SPU is kind of in this pickle. They were, before they took that vote, they were told by the Free Methodist Church, which is their affiliate, their Free Methodist institution, that they would lose their charter if they got rid of the ban on or the definition of sexual activity that's in their bylaws. And at the same time, it's a university that needs to compete for students in one of the most liberal cities in the country, and also one of the most secular cities in the country. SPU cut its tuition a few years ago by 25% in order to attract students. And at the same time, the faculty gave a vote of no confidence in the administration a couple of years ago because exactly for this policy. So it's out there in the marketplace trying to attract students to the university. It's being pressured by a fundamentalist, very conservative church, and it's having a revolt among its faculty and its students. And it feels like kind of a test point moment for what does SPU need to be and what does it want to be.
Jonathan, can I ask you something about this? What are the stakes here? What would happen to SPU? What would be the consequences if it were to lose its charter from the Methodist organization?
That's a really good question. I asked that actually myself, the reporter that did it, and they weren't sure. So I'm assuming that there is, I would assume there's some money maybe attached, but I don't know that for sure. It's also been a Free Methodist institution since 1891. I mean, it's a long history. So I'm going to guess that it's certainly an identity moment for that school, as well as what other kind of infrastructure or support would come with the affiliation.
And I also want to ask, you heard the students chanting there and asking administrators what they can do to make change. Do they really have any say over the Board of Trustees and decisions like this?
Certainly seen students pressure universities to do all kinds of things. When I was back, not too old, but when I was at the University of Washington, they pressured the board to withdraw from investments that supported the apartheid state in South Africa. We've seen all kinds of pressure from decarbonization, and Harvard recently is really owned up to its affiliation with slave owners and as part of a racist history. I don't know if SPU has a student on its board. But certainly these are students that are out there pressuring the university with the one tool it has, which is reputation. And schools will not survive if they have a reputation among prospective students, or they will attract a smaller set of students.
Well, I know the faculty council, there's this executive committee that's considering some kind of official action to push for the policy to be removed and maybe even for the board to be removed, but I don't know what power they have along those lines. But I wonder what these board members, I'd love to talk to them, because I wonder whether they would say they are thinking about their political pickle, as you said, and their reputation, and they're having to attract students in a liberal city, because theoretically, aren't they supposed to be doing what they think Jesus would want them to do?
I suspect that you would hear that, and I can hear my family has been affiliated with SPU say that what they're doing is what the Bible instructs, and this is their interpretation of the Christian faith. It's very hard to, we've seen over time that when people feel like they are following their faith, they have utmost certainty that they're doing the right thing. So I suspect, going to Katherine's question, at the ultimately the board members may just believe that this is exactly what their faith instructs.
There's another school rule in the works right now that might be related to biblical teaching. Isabella, you're in Snohomish County. Will you tell us what Marysville Public Schools is considering?
Yeah, and I wish I could say this is as clear cut as what's going on at SPU, but essentially, it all started back in February when a group of teachers had to present about a club that was proposed at a couple of elementary schools in light of a student suicide and other challenges they see among LGBTQ youth. And essentially it's called Safe Place Club. And it was just supposed to be a place where some LGBTQ elementary students could hang out once a week with peers, with counselors, and with teachers to kind of just talk and hang out, because sometimes kids don't have those spaces at home, as the statistics have shown. And then when Marysville school board members and some parents caught wind of this club being proposed, they started looking at what they said were ways to kind of heighten parental oversight. And I've chatted with some legal experts, I've chatted with the ACLU and the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction, and they're all concerned about how this is going to unfairly harm LGBTQ students who, would have to come out to their parents who they may not be out to in order to participate in these clubs.
Did you get a clear idea of where the law comes down on that question?
Well, from just the people who have weighed in so far, it's murky. A lot of it has to do with the impetus for creating this policy, and what it has looked like and what school board members have shared is that it did originate out of these conversations at the club, but they're arguing that it's not a direct attack on that club because it's going to apply to all clubs, the parental consent requirement.
Disparate impact.
Yep.
Maybe. Okay. So do we know how common this is, whether or not it's, it sounds like it may or may not be legal, but is this a common thing? Is this rare to, unique to Marysville?
It sounds like it. The OSPI is not aware of any other policies in the state that are like this. In research, I found that the state of Georgia has a policy like this that has been challenged. And other than that, it was proposed at one Idaho school district about a decade ago, and they ultimately dropped that proposal after long conversations with legal team and parents and students. So it's pretty rare.
I'm surprised, actually, that in Idaho and Georgia that there's not a blanket. You have to get your parents' permission. I mean, again, we were talking earlier about this. Especially Republican associated push to involve parents more, right? And don't let the schools teach my kid their values. It sounds like that's playing into this situation.
Right. It's similar to, banning books that might portray LGBTQ families or, any of those things where parents feel like their kids are being introduced to things that are to them out of the ordinary.
We're definitely in a moment right now where the civil rights movement for transgender folks is been again talking about politics being weaponized. There's an enormous pushback that's happening on the efforts to protect and represent and provide representation for transgender folks, particularly transgender kids. So it's not terribly surprising. I think that it's probably part of a swirl of concerns that are being amplified really in conservative media right now.
And something that's just especially surprising about this is Washington State has some of the most progressive gender inclusive policies. They have some that specifically prohibit, counselors from sharing students' preferred pronouns if they, aren't out to their parents and don't have that safe environment at home, which then by default schools become these safe spaces. And so these school board members, are essentially considering how to limit students' access to that.
I was wondering why if the students are not out to their parents, why are they meeting with a club that has under school auspices? So presumably there's a list of people belonging to I guess I don't know how the school runs it, but then you told me that counselors are involved in this safe place club. So maybe that's how they can get access to these school counselors separate from their academic responsibilities.
Right. And as far as I'm aware, if, a student is expressing that they feel like they can't come out to their parents or don't have access to that sort of community, then their counselor might direct them to this club as a place that they can go and just sort of talk through what they're feeling.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And it sounds like finally, as the Marysville School District considers this, did we mention that I think the school board moved to limit this parental permission requirement to just high school and I mean, I should say the opposite, to just elementary school and middle school, but high school kids don't need to get parental permission? Is that the current state of the policy?
Yep, that's where it's at.
Yeah. Okay.
I wonder Washington has a very broad medical privacy exemption that applies when you turn 13, I believe. 13-year-olds can exclude their parents from medical decisions. My understanding, the origin of that was related to abortion, but it has really, it's really come up in the context of mental health. We've got a great mental health team at the Seattle Times now that's doing a great work on pediatric psychiatric issues. And this issue comes up again and again. So I wonder if there's a kind of a bump up against the ability for a kid to keep medical decisions among, with them and their physician without parental permission. I don't know, just curious there.
Jonathan, when you're describing the conservative furor over transgender kids, I hadn't realized that the Marysville law rule would only be applied to elementary and middle school kids, and it certainly resonates with what I know about the conversation that's happening in some circles that is very much focused on perceived trans threat, and I use that with giant square quotes because that is not what's happening. But that's how it's referred to in some conservative circles, that people perceive as being targeted at young children and middle school age children in particular. So it makes sense to me, maybe, that if that was the impetus behind this rule, that elementary and middle school kids would be particularly targets of a parental consent sort of bylaw on the board.
Yeah, that's the same narrative going on in Marysville right now. And even if you open any social media apps where there's community groups like Nextdoor, Facebook groups, and there was even reference to Florida's Don't Say Gay bill as a model. So
it is, I mentioned earlier that the legislature had been historically cautious on guns. the legislature is not cautious on LGBTQ rights. It's one of the most progressive in the country on it. Speaker of the House is lesbian, and the voters here unequivocally endorse gay marriage before many other states did. So if this is going to really become a flashpoint, I could see the legislature actually being involved in doing something to directly protect these types of groups and bat back that effort.
Okay, that will be interesting. We'll see what happens in Marysville and maybe in Olympia. You're listening to Week in Review. We've got Isabella Breda here from the Everett Herald. That's Jonathan Martin from the Seattle Times, Katherine Long from Insider. And I want to talk about a move in the Seattle City Council this week, a first of its kind minimum wage protection for app-based service workers. The committee approved this change that would affect tens of thousands of gig workers for companies like Uber Eats and DoorDash and Instacart, where workers are contractors, and they often don't make minimum wage if you account for all their time and expenses. However, as was pointed out to me by Katherine, the council has carved out a big exception here. This is City Councilor Alex Peterson explaining that these on-demand companies like DoorDash, those are different from what he calls marketplace network companies like TaskRabbit or Rover.
Marketplace network companies who provide their brand, their customer base, their computer application technology to workers who actually set their own compensation rates should be exempt from this experimental new law so that we limit unintended negative consequences.
Okay, so Katherine, what are those unintended consequences, and why do you call this a major loophole in Seattle's pay up legislation?
Well, I think there's certainly some debate over whether these so-called marketplace network companies actually provide a true marketplace for the workers who use them. There's some restrictions on workers who use these apps. They are required to take they're required to accept a certain number of jobs in order to maintain their status as an app user. And that, Working Washington, the nonprofit organization that has been backing this gig worker minimum wage ordinance, they believe that that incentivizes workers to set their rates lower than they might otherwise. They are incentivized to try to make sure that they are maintaining the number of jobs that they need to in order to stay on the app.
Katherine, are you thinking of something like TaskRabbit? I want listeners
that's right.
to be able to, if they don't use.
So I'm thinking here about something like TaskRabbit or Rover, the dog walking service or the dog care service. Yeah. The other fear that, I think there's some debate over whether this fear is legitimate. The other fear is that apps like Uber or DoorDash could rejigger their interfaces to fall under the category of a marketplace network app. New York, which has a similar legislation for gig workers, they have a similar carve out for marketplace apps, so-called marketplace apps. And in New York, we haven't seen apps like Uber or DoorDash try to fall under that marketplace exemption. But Working Washington folks, they still point out that it's possible. It could happen if an app wanted to try to fall under that exemption.
So are you saying these dog walkers and task doers are also not making minimum wage when you take into account all their time and expenses?
Rates on those apps are typically higher than they are for apps like Uber and DoorDash. But folks who advocate for workers and gig workers say that they are still precarious jobs, and that all workers in the Seattle area should be subject to minimum wage laws.
Which in Seattle means a relatively high minimum wage.
That's right. We're up to over $17 an hour now. It's a very high minimum wage. That's right.
Yeah. We were talking about that. I think the Seattle Times had a little bit about how the income inequality, which you might think is, we're always hearing how huge the gap is in Seattle, how unaffordable it is, and rich people, et cetera. But it's not as big a gap as you might think relatively.
That's right. Yeah, the Seattle Times reported that the income gap between the folks who are earning the lowest 20% as opposed to the highest 20% in Seattle is actually not maybe as large as you might think it is if you're living in the city. I should say that there's a big caveat here, which is that income is a highly inexact proxy for wealth. We know, for instance, that Capitol Hill resident Andy Jassy just got awarded a $212 million compensation package, of which $211 million is shares of Amazon stock, and that is not being counted as income. So, the reporting on income as a measure of wealth inequality, I think, we should take that with a grain of salt. But one of the things that I found most interesting about the Seattle Times' analysis of income inequality in Seattle is that the city is more equal than places like New York or Atlanta, not necessarily because our high earners are earning less, but because our low earners are earning a lot more. And the Seattle Times' Gene Ball contributed that in large part to the city's high minimum wage.
Mm-hmm.
But I have a question for you. The Seattle has a history of setting standards for these app-based industry. I think there's a hazard pay rule that went in over COVID. And I think Seattle's the first in the country, I think, to pass that. I know Instacart's sued over it. Are you hearing any kind of threats if the city council passes this, which appears likely to, if you're going to see industry push back legally?
I think that's probably highly likely. We saw in California that app-based gig work companies launched a measure to try to defeat, similar legislation. So I think it would be likely that we would see a challenge. Yeah.
One more business question for you, Isabella. You pointed out that there's a hiring slowdown underway that everyone might not have heard about, but that you think it is or will be big enough that we would notice it in the Seattle area?
I think that was for me, right?
Sorry, I met Katherine. I said Isabella. Sorry. Yes, Katherine.
Yeah, we're seeing, my colleagues at Insider and I, we've been tracking hiring freezes at tech companies. Meta, Twitter, other companies have announced hiring freezes. Amazon, for the first time ever, has said that its warehouses are overstaffed. I think that the general mood among tech companies right now is sort of one of cautious trepidation and sniffing the air of a potential market slowdown. Taking Amazon as an example, which employs 60,000 corporate workers in the Seattle area, for the first time in at least a decade, the share of e-commerce spending as a proportion of total retail spending is starting to very, very slowly decline in the last couple of months. And I think Amazon is probably looking at that. They're looking at their overstaffed warehouses. They're looking at their huge warehouse overcapacity issue. And I think that, the mood at some of these tech companies is one of great caution, looking towards the months ahead. And I think that mood will probably trickle down to some of these employees in the Seattle area. That we might see some employees thinking twice about some of their discretionary spending in the months ahead.
Is that shoppers going back into stores, to physical?
That's right. Yeah, shoppers going back into physical stores. As the weather warms up, people are looking to shop in person again. Yeah.
It is interesting. I have a 20-year-old home from college and looking for jobs, and there is just oodles and oodles of jobs out there at the kind of the lower end. Lower, it's still, a lot of $20 an hour offers plus tips. It's interesting how robust the market is for food service and for all kinds of retail jobs.
Right.
Yeah, Nordstrom just had a big earnings report. Stock Zoom saying, "Hey, people are shopping again." Sorry, I interrupt you, Katherine. You were saying?
Isabella.
Sorry, I can't. You know what? On Zoom, it's sort of hard to tell who's talking sometimes. Isabella.
Yeah. Oh, no. Just in talking with staffers at different cities and stuff, talking about the job mobility during the pandemic, I think, speaking to Jonathan's point, is there's a lot of jobs available and there's a lot of higher paying, better quality, of course that's objective, but, people are moving around a lot more than they maybe ever used to because of that.
Right. Okay, I got it straight. That's Isabella Breda, cities reporter at the Everett Herald. And we've got insider tech correspondent Katherine Long and Seattle Times investigations editor Jonathan Martin. I'm Bill Radke. We're doing this visually on YouTube and Facebook, in case you want to search KUOW Public Radio there. We take a quick break and we start to round the bend and finish up on another week in review. Don't go away.
94.9 KUOW, Seattle's NPR news station. It's 12:47. Chance of showers is our forecast for this afternoon. We expect to reach a high in the mid-60s.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on Morning Edition. I'm Angela King. No matter what your morning sounds like, KUOW is here to give you a jump start on the day. Join me, Angela King, every weekday morning for local, national, and international news right here on 94.9 FM Seattle, or by asking your smart speaker to play KUOW.
Support for KUOW comes from Pacific Northwest Ballet, presenting All Tharp, a program of 3 works created by choreographer of stage and screen Twyla Tharp, at McCaw Hall, June 3rd through 12th. Tickets and info at pnb.org.
On KUOW's Week in Review, we're going to find out what was something to smile about this week in just a moment. First, Washington State's about to put a cap on fossil fuel emissions and require almost 100 of the state's biggest polluters to use a carbon trading system. And Jonathan, I just want to know, we've heard so many goals and promises on climate change. How big a deal is this Washington state move?
It's potentially very big. It's Washington, California's already has one in place. I believe Oregon's putting one in. But it will be a significant. They're creating a $500 million a year market for carbon, basically cap and trading. They're calling it cap and invest. It does apply to the biggest companies, 100 biggest companies. I think the threshold is 25,000 metric tons a year. A lot of utilities, oil refineries, paper mills that are going to be having to buy allowances for emitting. The allowances, I understand, are going down over years. And so they're going to be putting more and more cost on carbon with the intent to use the market forces to squeeze down efficiencies out of the private sector. It's passed last year. It's going in place in January, which feels like a fairly quick time frame. I know Nicholas Turner from our environment team kind of did a deep dive on it, and so they were doing a tremendous amount of work behind the scenes to set up regulations. It's a big deal. I've got a ton of questions about how this is actually going to work. So,
yeah, Isabella. I mean, Katherine, you were asking one of the same questions I was, which is basically about these companies have lobbyists, and what are they going to do with them?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I was looking at a great ProPublica report from a few years ago about how oil and gas companies were able to game cap and trade schemes in California. And that analysis found that carbon emissions from California's oil and gas industry rose 3.5% between 2013, when that state's cap and trade program was implemented in 2019, due to what that journalist called a quote unquote a bevy of concessions that the state had made to oil and gas titans like Chevron after the industry's lobbyists convinced the state to make some carve-outs for them.
Mm-hmm. And those allowances are being in the process of being decided right now. There's going to be sort of baseline allowances to the overall market. I've got exactly the same question, Katherine, about sort of how industries have a great incentive to get the best deal possible here, and how sophisticated Washington's regulators are going to be in getting to what the goal is, which is to have our carbon emissions go down dramatically.
Do you think that's more about overmatched regulators, or would you say the fix is in? How cynical are you?
I never like to go to motives. So I do think there's a very sophisticated set of lobbyists. One of the interesting elements of Washington's market is that, like I said, they're calling it cap and invest. So they're kicking off a chunk of that $500 million a year and going to be putting into green energy alternatives to carbon. That's, I think that also raises the question of how wisely, who's picking the winners here in the alternative energy industry, how wisely they're picking them, what kind of return we're going to be getting. And one thing that's one of the questions I have is, the environmental lobby had talked about the costs of these carbon allowances to be may not be borne much by consumers. I'm personally a little skeptical of that. I think there was a discussion about how in the oil industry that the distributors of gasoline would be absorbing the cost rather than passing it on in a big hits at the gas pump. So we are gonna be paying for this one way or another, and how wisely that money is going to be invested to actually get to, I think, what should be a shared goal of mitigating the worst effects of climate change.
Mm-hmm. Do we have any idea about what kind of green energy projects are being contemplated for this big pot of money?
I haven't seen good reporting on that yet. So I don't, it may be out, list be out there. I have not seen it.
Okay, I want to get to anything that gave us something to hope for, something to smile about this week. And I have something I want to start with, which is, I mentioned briefly this new podcast series of mine called Subtext, What Goes Unsaid. The first episode dropped this week, and the first episode's about having fearlessly curious conversations in dangerously divided times. Seattle journalist Monica Guzman told me we're so polarized right now, we've quit talking to each other.
At a time of so much anxiety and fear, we run for our silos. We run for the places that we feel comfortable. We run away from what makes us less comfortable. And what that means is that we become blind.
You could argue that that's the human brain, and you almost might as well not bother. Mel Brooks used to have this line that the first national anthem was, "Let them all go to hell except for Cave 76.
Yes. It was a nation. Yes. It was caves. Yes. Each cave had a national anthem. Yes. Well, do you remember the national anthem of your cave? Let them all go to hell except Cave 76.
Wherever we pick our in-group or we pick our out-group, why not just avoid those? You're probably not going to change their mind.
Yeah, no, you probably won't. You won't, But
what? Monica Guzman has the answer, because she dug into that topic for her book. Her new book's called I Never Thought of It That Way. And so we made a whole first episode about this, fraught conversations. Should we have that difficult conversation, and how to do it? And there's a lot there. This is, again, my series part of this new KUOW podcast. If you want to hear that and more, go to the podcast called KUOW Shorts, wherever you get your podcast. So that's making me smile this week. I hand it off to you, Cave 75 and 77 and 78.
Bill, that was such a cliffhanger. I can't wait to listen.
Now you got to go to KUOW Shorts and hear more.
What's making me smile? The long weekend coming up, and I read this great report in GeekWire about a Sammamish teenager who won a prize at an international science fair for developing an AI-powered system to help drivers detect animals on the roadway after one of his family members' dogs was struck and killed by a car. And I would say my dog is also smiling about this.
So it's like a car camera or a car sort of radar, but using
it's
AI.
AI dog radar. It's the best way I could describe it.
Okay. Nice. AI will know when that's a dog. That's great. Good. See, don't sleep on kids these days. Way to go, Sammamish.
Great.
13.
Yeah.
What else was smile worthy?
I have another story about the youths that I hate to bring up Marysville one more time. But anyway, the Everett High School GSA, or Gender and Sexuality Alliance, has been brainstorming ways that they can support LGBTQ kids in Marysville schools. And I thought that was pretty heartwarming.
How do they want to support them? Did you get a sense?
They're probably going to do letter writing and flag waving and get out there before the vote coming up on June 6th.
Wow. How about you, Jonathan? What was the story?
I had actually a couple of stories this week. I smiled at one. There was my colleague David Croman wrote about a a neighborhood in Greenwood that really wanted a crosswalk and was getting rebuffed by the city. And so they basically got mad and didn't take it anymore. And they went out and paid in themselves a crosswalk across Greenwood Avenue.
I saw that, and they didn't really try to fool anybody. I mean,
No.
it doesn't look exactly like the standard sidewalks.
Oh, it's just like, this is our sidewalk. This is our crosswalk. Damn it.
And then didn't the city like scrape it up?
Yeah, that was. But wow. I think message sent though. Like they got somebody's attention there. The other one is just I noticed that the butterfly exhibit at the Woodland Park Zoo reopening. I live near the zoo, and when my kids were younger, we used to go. And if you ever want a moment of Zen, go into the butterfly exhibit. Just sit there and watch the butterflies. It is truly lovely. It's an oasis.
No, see, I've been burnt before. You go in there, you think the butterflies are going to land on you, and they veer away at the last possible second. They never settle.
We'll have to find you another moment of Zen, Katherine.
Yeah, we need to bring you back there. You need to resolve this, Katherine.
Been burned before. Conned by the butterfly exhibit.
And a little hat tip to Jeopardy, which you remember the Mazda cars that were getting stuck several months ago, stuck on KUOW. You couldn't turn them off. You couldn't use your navigation system. It made it into Jeopardy.
And ripped from the headlines for 1,000.
Thanks to a glitch, some Seattle Mazda drivers can't tune their radios away from NPR. So at 7 a.m., it's this show or nothing. Bonnie.
But is all things considered?
No! Bonnie.
That would be Morning Edition.
I could have been a millionaire. I don't think they've totally resolved that issue. I'll pass it on when they do.
I really respect you guys really like leaned into this too. Yeah. Like you guys really owned it. It was, I think it turned into like part of the fund drive, and it was like, I appreciate that.
It's a driveway moment that never ends, Jonathan. That's Jonathan Martin, Seattle Times investigations editor, and we've had Everett Herald Cities reporter Isabella Breda and Insiders tech correspondent Katherine Long, our journalist panel this week on Week in Review. It's been a joy. Great to see you. Great to hear you. Thanks for coming on, everybody.
Thanks, Bill.
Thanks, Bill.
See you soon. This show is produced by Kevin Kniestet with social media and live streaming by Tio Popescu and Juan Pablo Chiquiza. Bernard Ouellet makes it all sound great with the dials and the faders on the board. Thanks.